My name is Claire Bennett, and I'm 31 years old. 3 weeks ago, my mother looked me straight in the eye during my grandmother's will reading and smiled. You were always her biggest disappointment. She said it in front of 14 people. My father, my brother, 2 attorneys, family friends. She never lowered her voice. She wanted everyone in that room to hear it. According to the will that had just been read, my parents had inherited my grandmother's entire estate. Her house, her savings, her investments, everything. My older brother, Ethan, received a generous share as well. I wasn't mentioned once. Not a dollar. Not a single sentence. Nothing. But what my mother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Grandma Margaret had been preparing for that exact moment for 7 years. And when another attorney walked into the room carrying a second envelope, every person sitting at that table realized the story wasn't over. Before I tell you what happened, if you enjoy stories about family betrayal, justice, and impossible choices, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video and subscribed, but only if you genuinely enjoy stories like this. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? I'd love to read every answer. I grew up in Carmel, Indiana. It's one of those places where beautiful neighborhoods hide ugly secrets. People smile at charity events, wave to each other at church, talk about family values, then spend the drive home criticizing everyone they just hugged. My father, Thomas Bennett, owned a successful commercial real estate company called Bennett Property Group. My mother, Victoria, managed everything else. The charity dinners, the social events, the neighborhood reputation. Appearances meant everything to her. Reality never mattered as much. Then there was my older brother Ethan, 4 years older than me, confident, ambitious. Exactly the son my parents had always wanted. After graduating from college, Ethan joined my father's company. By the time he turned 30, he had his own executive office. Every family dinner somehow became another celebration of Ethan, another story about another successful deal, another speech about his bright future, another reminder that one day he would inherit the family business. I became a third-grade teacher in Bloomington. I loved every second of it. Children don't care how expensive your watch is. They don't care what neighborhood you live in. They care whether you remember their favorite color, whether you listen when they're scared, whether you celebrate when they finally solve a math problem they thought was impossible. To me, that mattered. To my parents. It was embarrassing. Whenever relatives asked what I did for a living, my mother answered before I had the chance. Claire teaches 3rd grade. She always smiled politely. The kind of smile people use when apologizing for something. It's nice. Then she'd immediately turn toward Ethan. Now Ethan just closed another $5 million commercial deal. Every holiday, every birthday, every Thanksgiving, the conversation always found its way back to him. After a while, I stopped trying to change the subject. There was no point. But there was one person who never made me feel invisible. My grandmother, Margaret Bennett. To her, I wasn't the forgotten daughter. I wasn't the disappointment. I was simply Claire, and that made all the difference. I realized just how different we were as a family. On my 30th birthday, I'd invited everyone to my apartment for dinner. Nothing extravagant. Homemade pasta, garlic bread, a bottle of wine. The people I loved. I'd spent 2 days cleaning, bought fresh flowers, even ironed the tablecloth. Dad canceled that morning. Golf tournament. Couldn't be helped. Ethan called an hour later. Important client meeting. Mom arrived almost 2 hours late. She kissed my cheek, handed me a birthday card with $50 inside. And no handwritten message, just her signature. She stayed long enough to drink half a glass of wine before checking her watch. I really should get going. 40 minutes later, she was gone. A week afterward, I accidentally learned she'd bought Ethan a Rolex to celebrate his promotion. A Rolex. I received $50. The comparison hurt more than I wanted to admit. But before any of that happened, at exactly 7 that morning, my phone rang. Grandma Margaret. She sang Happy Birthday completely off key. She laughed halfway through because she'd forgotten one of the lines. Then she said something I'll never forget. Claire, you're the kindest person this family has ever produced. She paused. One day they'll understand your value. Another pause. If they don't, she chuckled softly. That's their loss. Later that afternoon, a package arrived. A tin filled with her famous brown butter oatmeal cookies. Inside was a handwritten note. Never let anyone convince you that kindness is weakness. The world always needs more people like you. I still have that card today. Back then, I thought it was simply another loving message from my grandmother. I had no idea. She was already preparing to protect me from the very people who were supposed to love me most. If there was one thing my grandmother understood better than anyone else, it was people. She had an extraordinary ability to look past polished smiles and rehearsed words. While everyone else admired expensive suits and impressive titles, Grandma Margaret watched how people treated waiters, neighbors, and strangers. She always said that character revealed itself in ordinary moments, not extraordinary ones. I didn't fully understand what she meant until I grew older. Every Sunday afternoon, I'd visit her little brick house on the edge of Carmel. She refused to move into a retirement community, no matter how many times my parents insisted. Those places are lovely, my mother would say. Grandma would smile politely. Maybe for someone else. Then she'd change the subject. Looking back now, I don't think she trusted them enough to give up her independence. Her house felt different from everywhere else. It smelled like cinnamon, old books, fresh coffee, and lavender. Family photographs covered nearly every wall. Not expensive portraits, real memories, children covered in mud, Christmas mornings, fishing trips, burned birthday cakes, pictures of people laughing instead of posing. Every frame reminded me that families weren't supposed to be perfect, they were supposed to be honest. One rainy Sunday, while we baked apple pie together, Grandma suddenly asked, Claire, are you happy? The question caught me off guard. I think so. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. That's not an answer. I laughed. I love teaching. I know you do. I love my students. She nodded. But do you love your life? For several seconds, I couldn't answer. Because deep down, I knew something was missing. Not money. Not success. Acceptance. I had spent most of my life trying to earn love that should never have needed earning. Grandma quietly reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Stop chasing people who enjoy watching you run. Those words stayed with me. Around that time, my parents were preparing for Ethan's engagement party. It wasn't really an engagement party. It was more like a business convention disguised as a family celebration. Real estate investors, developers, bank executives, people whose conversations revolved around profits and tax strategies. I almost declined the invitation, but Grandma convinced me to come. Your family, she said, never let anyone make you feel otherwise. The evening went exactly as I expected. Crystal chandeliers, champagne flowing endlessly, everyone complimenting Ethan and Lauren on their future together. Dad gave a speech about legacy. Mom cried on cue. People applauded. Someone joked that Ethan was destined to build an empire bigger than his father's. Everyone laughed. Then someone asked me, So Claire, when are you finally leaving teaching? The room became quiet. Before I could answer, Mom smiled. She's still figuring things out. Still figuring things out. I'd been teaching for 8 years. I owned my own apartment. I paid every bill myself. Yet somehow, I was still the child who hadn't succeeded. Grandma slowly put down her coffee cup. She looked directly at my mother. Claire doesn't need to figure anything out. The room froze. She already knows who she is. Nobody spoke. Grandma continued calmly. Finding purpose is far more difficult than making money. My father's smile disappeared. Someone quickly changed the subject, but I noticed something strange. Grandma wasn't angry. She looked disappointed. Not in me, in them. Later that night, as I helped her into the car, she sighed. I wish your grandfather could see this. See what? How obsessed everyone has become with appearances. She stared out the windshield. Money has a way of convincing people they're good simply because they're successful. Then she smiled at me. Promise me something. Anything. Never measure your worth using someone else's ruler. I promised Dada T the time. I thought it was just another piece of grandmotherly wisdom. Now I realize she was trying to prepare me for everything that was coming. About 6 months later, Grandma asked me to drive her to an attorney's office in downtown Bloomington. I offered to wait in the lobby. She shook her head. No, I'd rather you come inside. The receptionist greeted her by name. That surprised me. She'd clearly been there before. A distinguished older attorney welcomed us into his office. His name was William Carter. The meeting lasted less than an hour. I wasn't involved in most of the conversation. They discussed documents, signatures, witnesses, financial accounts. Several times, William glanced toward me before looking back at Grandma. When everything was finished, she placed her hand over mine. Thank you for bringing me. Of course. As we walked back to the car, I casually asked, everything okay? She smiled. Everything is exactly as it should be. I didn't ask another question. I respected her privacy. If only I'd known that quiet afternoon in a lawyer's office would become the reason my entire family would one day turn against each other. As the months passed, Grandma Margaret began slowing down. Not all at once. The changes were subtle. She'd pause halfway through a sentence, searching for a word she'd always known. She grew tired after tending to her garden for only 20 minutes. Some afternoons, she'd quietly fall asleep in her favorite armchair while reading. When I suggested seeing a doctor, she smiled the same reassuring smile she'd worn my entire life. I'm 83, sweetheart. Things were out, but something in. Her eyes told me she already knew more than she was saying. A few weeks later, she finally agreed to a full medical examination. I drove her to every appointment, blood tests, scans, specialists. My parents came exactly once. Dad spent most of the appointment answering emails. Mom complained about how cold the waiting room was. Ethan never came at all. He always had an important meeting, or a business trip, or a dinner with clients. Grandma never criticized them. Not once. She simply stopped expecting them to show up. One evening, after another hospital visit, we stopped at her favorite little diner. It had been there for over 40 years. The waitress didn't even need to ask what Grandma wanted. Chicken soup, grilled cheese, hot tea. As we waited for our food, Grandma looked out the window. Do you know what the saddest part of growing old is? I shook my head. Watching people become strangers while they're still alive. I frowned. What do you mean? She smiled sadly. People don't change overnight, Claire. They change one small decision at a time. One excuse. One selfish choice. One broken promise. She stirred her tea. By the time you notice, the person you loved is already gone. I wasn't sure whether she was talking about aging or about my family. That winter, Christmas felt unusually quiet. Dad insisted on hosting dinner at their house. Everything looked perfect. A professionally decorated tree, expensive gifts, crystal glasses, matching napkins. It could have been the cover of a magazine, but beneath all that perfection, nobody seemed happy. Mom spent the evening criticizing the catering. Dad answered business calls between courses. Ethan talked non-stop about expanding Bennett Property Group into 2 neighboring states. Lauren smiled politely without saying much. Grandma mostly watched, listening, observing. I caught her staring at each of us more than once, almost as if she were memorizing our faces. When dessert arrived, Dad raised his glass. To family. Everyone echoed the toast. Grandma quietly added, and to honesty. Nobody repeated that part. The silence lasted only a second, but I noticed it. So did she. A week after Christmas, Grandma asked if I could help organize some boxes in the attic. We spent nearly 4 hours sorting old photographs and documents. At one point, she handed me a small wooden box. Keep this for me. I looked inside. Old letters, Several photographs, a silver pocket watch that had belonged to Grandpa. Are you sure? She nodded. Some things should stay with the person who understands their value. I promised to keep it safe. Looking back, that was probably the moment she made her final decision. Early spring brought news none of us wanted. The doctors had found an aggressive form of cancer. There were treatment options, but no guarantees. Mom cried. Dad immediately started asking about insurance and medical specialists. Ethan offered to pay for any experimental treatment available. Grandma thanked everyone, then quietly chose not to pursue aggressive therapy. I'd rather spend the time I have left living, Dad argued. Mom begged. Ethan insisted. She listened patiently, then answered with one sentence. This is my life. Nobody argued after that. From then on, I visited almost every evening. Sometimes we played cards, sometimes we baked, sometimes we simply sat on the porch watching the sunset without speaking. Those became my favorite moments. Silence never felt uncomfortable with Grandma. It felt peaceful. One evening, she suddenly asked, Claire, promise me one more thing. Anything. When I'm gone. She paused for a long moment. Don't let bitterness become your inheritance. I felt tears forming. Don't talk like that. She smiled gently. Everyone leaves eventually. What matters is what they leave behind. At the time, I thought she meant memories. I had no idea she meant something much bigger, something my parents would never see coming. 2 months later, at T5:42 on a quiet Tuesday morning, my phone rang. It was the hospital. Grandma Margaret had passed away peacefully during the night. For several minutes, I couldn't move. The world outside my apartment continued exactly as it always had. Cars drove past, people walked their dogs, someone across the street laughed. But my world had stopped. I had just lost the one person who had loved me without conditions, and I still didn't know. She had already written the final chapter of our family's story. The funeral took place on a gray Saturday morning. The sky hung low over the cemetery, threatening rain but never quite delivering it. Grandma Margaret would have laughed. Even the weather can't make up its mind. She used to say, more than 100 people came. Former neighbors, church friends, teachers, local business owners, people I'd never met before. One after another, they walked up to me and shared stories I'd never heard. She paid for my daughter's college textbooks. She visited my husband every week after his stroke. She helped us keep our bakery open during the recession. Grandma had quietly changed dozens of lives without ever mentioning it. Meanwhile, my parents stood near the front, accepting condolences as though they were hosting another social event. Dad shook hands with business associates. Mom thanked everyone with practiced grace. Ethan spent half the service checking his phone. I tried not to judge. Grief affects everyone differently. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. After the burial, everyone gathered at my parents' house. The dining room overflowed with catered food. People spoke in hushed voices. Some cried, others shared stories that made everyone smile. For a brief moment, it almost felt like a real family. Then I overheard my father. We'll need to meet with James early next week. James Sullivan, the family attorney. There are several financial matters that need immediate attention. Mom nodded. The house should sell quickly, Ethan added. We'll probably renovate before listing it. I stared at them. Grandma had been gone for less than 3 hours. They were already discussing the value of her house. Lauren noticed my expression. She looked uncomfortable but said nothing. The following Tuesday, James Sullivan called. The reading of Mrs. Bennett's will take place Friday morning at 10. His voice was calm and professional. All immediate family members are expected to attend. I thanked him and hung up. For the next 3 days, I barely thought about the inheritance, honestly. I assumed everything would go to my parents. Grandma had always been practical. She believed parents should provide for their children. Even if she loved me more than anyone else, I never expected to receive much. Maybe one of her photo albums, her recipe box, the old pocket watch, that would have been enough. The memories were worth more than money. Or so I believed. Friday arrived. James Sullivan's office occupied the top floor of a quiet brick building in downtown Carmel. The conference room overlooked the courthouse. A long walnut table filled the center. Fresh coffee sat untouched. Nobody seemed interested. Dad entered first, perfectly tailored navy suit. Confident posture, business as usual. Mom followed, dressed entirely in black despite the funeral having ended days earlier. Ethan and Lauren arrived together. Lauren quietly smiled at me. Ethan barely acknowledged I was there. Then James entered carrying a leather folder. "Thank you all for coming." He waited until everyone sat. Mrs. Margaret Bennett signed her final will approximately 6 years ago. He adjusted his glasses. "After reviewing all legal requirements, I can confirm the document is valid and enforceable." Dad leaned back comfortably, almost relaxed, as though the outcome had already been decided. Maybe he believed it had. James began reading. The first few items were exactly what I'd expected: personal jewelry, family heirlooms, small charitable donations. Then came the estate itself. The residence located on Willow Creek Road. Dad nodded slightly. "All investment accounts." Mom folded her hands together. "Commercial holdings." Ethan exchanged a quick glance with Dad. James continued reading. "Everything. The house, the investments, the brokerage accounts, nearly every significant asset passed to my parents. Ethan received a generous financial gift. Lauren received several family heirlooms." Then, James reached the final page. He looked up. "Claire Bennett." For one brief second, I held my breath. "Mrs. Bennett leaves you her personal recipe collection, several family photographs, and her late husband's pocket watch." That was all. James closed the folder. Silence settled over the room. Mom smiled, not a warm smile, a victorious one. Then she looked directly at me. "I suppose your grandmother knew who was truly prepared to handle responsibility." Nobody responded. Dad avoided eye contact. Ethan stared out the window. My face burned with embarrassment, not because I cared about the money, because, for one painful moment, it felt as though Grandma had agreed with them, as though everyone had been right about me all along. I stood. "Congratulations." My voice barely sounded like mine. "I hope it brings you happiness." I reached for the door. Then someone knocked. 3 slow knocks. Everyone turned. James frowned. "Excuse me." He opened the door. An older gentleman stood in the hallway holding a slim black briefcase. James looked genuinely surprised. "William." The man smiled politely. "I'm afraid we're not quite finished." He stepped into the room carrying a sealed cream-colored envelope. Every eye followed him. None of us realized the real will reading was only just beginning. William Carter closed the conference room door behind him before setting his briefcase on the polished walnut table. The room had gone completely silent. Even my father, who always seemed to have a confident answer for everything, looked confused. James Sullivan stood. "William, I wasn't aware you were coming." William smiled politely. "Mrs. Bennett specifically instructed me not to contact anyone until after her primary will had been read in full." A strange feeling settled over me. Grandma had planned this. Every second of it. William carefully removed a cream-colored envelope from his briefcase. Across the front, written in Grandma's unmistakable handwriting, were 7 words: "To be opened only after my will is read." My mother frowned. "What exactly is this?" William ignored the question. Instead, he carefully broke the wax seal. "Margaret Bennett retained my firm 7 years ago." His calm voice filled the room. "During that time, she created several legal instruments that exist independently from the will Mr. Sullivan has just presented." Dad leaned forward. "I'm sorry. Independently?" "Correct." William nodded. "These assets were never part of Mrs. Bennett's probate estate." James slowly adjusted his glasses. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely surprised. William unfolded the first document. "Mrs. Bennett established an irrevocable trust funded over a period of 7 years." He paused. Current value. He glanced at the paperwork. $12,743,000. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. I honestly thought I'd misheard him. 12 million? Grandma? How? Dad blinked. That can't be right. William calmly slid several financial statements across the table. I'm afraid it is. Mom finally found her voice. Why wasn't this mentioned in the will? Because it isn't governed by the will. William answered without emotion. Mrs. Bennet intentionally transferred these assets years before her passing. James quietly reviewed the documents. His expression changed, then changed again. Finally, he looked at my father. Everything appears to be legally valid. Dad's confident posture disappeared. William continued reading. The Margaret Bennet Educational Trust shall become active immediately following my death. Educational trust. I looked around the room. None of this made sense. Grandma had never mentioned a trust. Never hinted she possessed that kind of money. William looked toward me. Mrs. Bennet named one primary beneficiary. Every pair of eyes slowly turned in my direction. My stomach tightened. Claire Bennet. Silence. Not ordinary silence, the kind that changes people's lives. Mom laughed. One short, disbelieving laugh. There must be some mistake. William calmly shook his head. There isn't. Impossible. Dad spoke quietly. Margaret would never. William interrupted him for the first time. She would. Then he opened another page. Mrs. Bennet anticipated that reaction. He looked directly at my parents. She left written instructions explaining every decision. He unfolded another handwritten letter. If you're hearing this, he began, then my family is probably wondering why Claire received something they did not. My heart started racing. It felt like Grandma was sitting in the room with us. The answer is simple. William paused before continuing. Claire loved me. Nobody moved. Not because I owned property, not because I had investments, not because she expected anything in return. She loved me because I was her grandmother. I felt tears burning my eyes. William continued reading. Over the last 10 years, Claire visited me hundreds of times. She drove me to doctor's appointments, cooked meals, fixed things around my house, sat with me when I couldn't sleep, held my hand after difficult medical appointments, expected absolutely nothing. He looked up briefly. Nobody at the table could meet my eyes. Then he continued. The rest of my family visited mostly on birthdays, holidays, or when financial matters needed discussing. Mom suddenly stood. That's not true. William quietly waited until she finished, then resumed reading exactly where he'd stopped. Actions always speak louder than excuses. Grandma had written every word. My father slowly shook his head. Margaret was manipulated. William closed the letter. Actually, he removed a thick binder from his briefcase. Mrs. Bennet anticipated someone might make that accusation. He placed the binder on the table. Inside are journals documenting nearly every visit she received over the past decade. He opened it. Every page contained dates, names, notes, who visited, who called, who canceled, who stayed, who left after 15 minutes. Everything. Grandma had documented it all. William looked around the room. Mrs. Bennet wanted there to be no misunderstanding. Then he read the final paragraph. Money reveals character. I've already seen yours. This trust belongs to Claire because she earned something none of you ever did. My complete trust. The room fell silent again, only this time nobody had anything left to say. For nearly a full minute, no one spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument ever could. My father was the first to stand. He slowly buttoned his jacket, took a deep breath, and forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Claire, I'm sure we can talk about this as a family. William Carter calmly closed the folder. Mrs. Bennet specifically instructed me that today's meeting was to end immediately after the trust was disclosed. Dad ignored him. This isn't what your grandmother wanted. Before I could answer, William looked directly at him. Actually, it's exactly what she wanted. My mother finally found her voice. Claire, sweetheart. The words sounded strange coming from her. I couldn't remember the last time she'd called me that. You've always been emotional. Maybe you don't fully understand what managing this amount of money involves. I stared at her. For 31 years, she'd questioned every decision I'd ever made. Now, suddenly, she was worried about me. It wasn't concern, it was fear. Ethan leaned forward. Nobody is saying Grandma didn't love you. He paused. But $12 million. That's life-changing money. I looked at him. It was life-changing for Grandma too. He didn't answer. Because we both knew the truth. When Grandma needed someone to drive her to chemotherapy, he had always been too busy. William quietly handed me another envelope. Mrs. Bennet asked me to give you this only after the trust was revealed. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. The papers smelled faintly of lavender, just like her house. I recognized her handwriting immediately. My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, then everything happened exactly as I expected. A part of me wishes I had been wrong. I hoped your parents would remember what truly matters before it was too late, but hope is not a legal strategy. Despite everything, I laughed through my tears. That sounded exactly like Grandma. You may be wondering why I created this trust. The answer is simple. This money was never meant to reward anyone. It was meant to continue helping people. I frowned. William nodded. Please keep reading. For years, you've told me stories about children who came to school hungry, students whose parents couldn't afford books, children who believed college was impossible because nobody in their family had ever gone. Every time you told me one of those stories, your eyes filled with tears. Not because you felt sorry for them, because you wanted to help. My vision blurred. I remembered every one of those conversations. I never imagined she'd remembered them too. That's why this trust isn't really for you. It's entrusted to you. There's a difference. You will receive a comfortable income for the rest of your life. But the majority of the trust must be used to create educational opportunities for children who deserve a chance. I looked at William. He nodded. Those are the trust's conditions. Suddenly, everything made sense. Grandma hadn't left me $12 million to make me rich. She'd left me a responsibility. Mom shook her head in disbelief. So she gave everything away? William answered calmly. No, she gave it to the person she believed would honor her wishes. Dad took one slow step toward me. Claire, you don't have to do this. Families make mistakes. I couldn't help it. I smiled. Not because anything was funny, because it was the first time I'd ever heard him admit that. You're right. I said quietly. Families do make mistakes. I paused. The problem is, ours kept making the same one for 15 years. Neither he nor my mother could look at me. 2 weeks later, the phone calls began. First my mother, then my father, then Ethan. They all wanted to meet. Talk. Apologize. Explain. For years, I'd waited for those conversations. Now, they arrived only after they discovered I controlled a $12 million trust that hurt more than the inheritance itself. Because I couldn't stop wondering, would they have called if Grandma had left me nothing? Deep down, I already knew the answer. I didn't return any of their calls. Not immediately. Not because I wanted revenge, and not because I hated them. I simply needed time. For the first time in my life, I wanted to make a decision without worrying about whether my family would approve. 3 weeks later, I met with William Carter in his office. The trust documents filled nearly 300 pages, scholarship guidelines, investment policies, financial reports, everything Grandma had spent years creating. She hadn't simply left money behind. She had built a future. William smiled as I signed the final documents. Mrs. Bennet chose wisely. I looked up. I hope so. He shook his head. No, I know so. That summer, we officially launched a Margaret Bennett Foundation. Its mission was simple: help children whose families couldn't afford educational opportunities, scholarships, school supplies, reading programs, teacher grants, mental health support. No television cameras. No ribbon cutting ceremonies. No giant photographs with oversized checks. Grandma had never helped people for recognition, neither would we. The first scholarship recipient was a quiet 11-year-old girl named Ava. She loved science. Her mother worked 2 jobs. Her father had passed away years earlier. She'd nearly given up on attending the summer engineering camp she'd dreamed about. The foundation covered every expense. A few weeks later, she mailed us a handwritten thank you letter. At the bottom she had written, "One day I want to help kids the way someone helped me." I cried when I read it, not because of the words, because I could almost hear Grandma saying, "See, kindness always comes back." A month after launching the foundation, my father appeared at my apartment, alone. He looked older, not physically, emotionally. His shoulders seemed heavier. His confidence had faded. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, "I wasn't a very good father." There was no excuse. No explanation, just 6 honest words. I invited him inside. We talked for nearly 3 hours. About Grandpa, about Grandma, about childhood, about mistakes. He admitted he'd spent so many years trying to build a successful business that he'd forgotten how to build a family. When he left, he hugged me. It was the first real hug I could remember receiving from him since I was a teenager. My mother took much longer, almost 6 months. She never apologized the way Dad had. Instead, she sent me a package. Inside was my 3rd grade report card, a photograph of me holding a spelling bee trophy, and dozens of drawings I'd made as a child. On top said a small note. I should have reminded you how proud I was. Instead, I kept reminding you who you weren't. I'm sorry. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. For the first time, that was enough. Ethan was different. He called several times. Eventually we met for coffee. He looked embarrassed. I kept thinking, Grandma chose you because she loved you more. I quietly shook my head. She chose me because she trusted me. He stared into his coffee. There's a difference, isn't there? A big one. He nodded slowly. I spent years trying to impress her. I smiled sadly. I never tried. Neither of us spoke after that. Sometimes silence says everything. One crisp October afternoon, I visited Grandma's grave. The maple trees surrounding the cemetery had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. I placed fresh white lilies beside her headstone. Then I sat on the grass, just like I used to sit beside her porch. You were right, I whispered. Kindness isn't weakness. The breeze stirred the leaves around me. For a moment, I almost expected to hear her laugh. Instead, I remembered something she'd told me years before. The greatest inheritance isn't money, it's the person you become while earning it. Back then, I hadn't understood. Now I did. People often ask if I forgave my family. The answer surprises them. Yes. Eventually. Not because they deserved forgiveness, not because everything was magically repaired, but because carrying resentment would have made me exactly the person Grandma never wanted me to become. Forgiveness didn't erase the past. It simply stopped allowing the past to control my future. Today, 5 years later, the Margaret Bennett Foundation has helped more than 400 children. Some are now in college, others became teachers, one became an engineer, another recently graduated from medical school. Every year, on Grandma's birthday, we invite every scholarship recipient to a small picnic in the park. No speeches. No reporters, just families, children laughing, teachers sharing stories, people helping people. Exactly the way Grandma would have wanted. Sometimes, after everyone goes home, I stay behind. For a few extra minutes, I watch the empty picnic tables, listen to the wind, and smile, because I finally understand something that took me 31 years to learn. My grandmother's greatest gift was never the trust.it, wasn't the money.it, wasn't even the foundation. Her greatest gift was proving that love is measured by the lives we change, not the wealth we leave behind. And every time another child gets the chance they never thought possible, I know she's still changing lives, just as she always did.
Thanks for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.